So that's the reason why there's this impotence to have an experience, not just a conceptual understanding of selflessness. And I just want to pinpoint this problem that comes up, right? So if you want an experience of an absence, it seems like you cannot rely on the senses for that, right? So do you want to just talk about that problem for a little bit, and then like Dharmakirit is sort of
yes. So then we're into a whole how to put it, this all then emerges as a problem, considerably later than the earlier period we've been talking about. By the time, so when we say, okay, if we say, first of all, well, actually, there's really going to be a very clear distinction between a kind of sensory moment or perceptual moment in which we're not engaged in something that we would call vikalpa, right, conceptuality, and some kind of subsequent interpretation, maybe just a few hundred milliseconds later, like where we're actually interpreting some kind of a content. And that now counts as vikalpa, that's conceptual. When we make that kind of a distinction, we need one of the ways we're going to make that distinction, or one of the ways, Dignaga and Dharmakirit, these two very important philosophers from around the 5th to 6th century-ish, 6th, 7th century, is to say that when we make that move, part of the reason we're making that move is we're talking about what it means for something to be real, actually. And Dharmakirit famously says, sort of anticipating the Western philosopher Bishop Berkeley, upalabdir sattvam, which means to be is to be perceived, right? In other words, that part of what we mean by something being real is that we're having, that it's impacting our senses. And what's our model for that impact is causality. So if something is impacting our senses, it has to be causally active. And here's the key point. When we talk about like concepts are engaging with things that are not causally active. They can't be causally active. They have to be causally inert. This is a little complicated, but the basic idea here is if something is causally active, it has to change on this account, on this Buddhist account. If it changes, then it can't serve as what an object of thought is, because when I think like the thought of a cow, or like I've got a pen here. If the idea of a pen, what we call the universal of a pen, like the penness of a pen, if it changes, then right now it's a pen, and then penness changes, and now this isn't a pen anymore. So that fundamental problem means that the world of thought, so to speak, has to be about kind of causally inert entities. That doesn't mean that that thoughts themselves as thoughts can have impacts on us causally. But what they supposedly refer to, right, the idea of a pen, so to speak, has to be causally inert. So that means that anytime we are actually engaging with something that is, what we mean by something real is that it's something that's causally impacting our senses in some direct or indirect way. And that rules out everything that has to do with like the idea of a pen, the idea of a person. All of those, what we call philosophically, what we call universals, the penness, the personness, and so on. We can't interact with those things causally. We can't perceive them as real things in the world. We can just, in a sense, construct them mentally. So as a result of that, if we're going to be knowing an absence, for example, absences also are causally inert. So selflessness is another example of this kind of a construction. Like it's an absence of something, but you can't causally interact with the absence of something. It's just, how would you do that? It's not a thing. It doesn't come from anywhere, and it doesn't produce any effects. So like if you say, well, there's no elephant in my hand, you can't actually see the absence of the elephant. And from Dharmakirit's perception, what you see is you actually see the surface of my hand, and you actually engage in a kind of inference, which is, well, an elephant would usually be a perceptible thing. What I see is actually just a hand and no elephant. Therefore, there's no elephant there, right? So that's a kind of a crude way of putting Dharmakirit's theory of what's called an inference by way of non-perception. So the upshot of that is that if we need to know selflessness that means that we're knowing a negation. That means we're knowing a concept. We're knowing something that's causally inert. And what we have to do, in a sense, is just focus on the concept itself. And this is where Dharmakirti's theory gets pretty wild. He basically says, just like we can induce a kind of hallucination by focusing on, corpses and visualizing bodies as skeletons, eventually we have a kind of perceptual experience, a purely mental perceptual experience of skeletons. Likewise, we can do that with selflessness, where we focus on the idea of selflessness, and it induces a kind of hallucination almost of selflessness. It's not a thing. It's like a mentally constructed entity. And interestingly, one of the examples he gives is like, the person who's completely overwhelmed by their desire for someone, thinking again and again and again about the person, and then finally having a hallucination of the person.